Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, the author of 3 previous novels. His 4th is The Bootlegger's Bride. Rick Skwiot joins me on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here, Michael.
So, in the acknowledgments, you talk about, your parents and their you kind of plumbed their memories of St. Louis around this time of their own kind of tangential relationship with bootlegging. How much of this did you know when you started writing the story? Like, was this based on what you knew from stories they'd told you previously?
Well, yes. Actually, it was one of the reasons I started writing the book, because I'd always been fascinated as a child and later on by the stories I heard from my parents and also from my grandmothers about that period, and also about not only bootlegging but also the Depression and World War II. And so my curiosity about that led me to start working on this book quite a few years back, I guess 4 or 5 years ago.
So, did you have specific questions you wanted answered from them when it came to that period, or did what they provided give you a bunch of questions that you went off on your own and tried to answer?
Well, I went off on my own. My parents are deceased now, so my grandparents. So, but I heard these stories, fascinating stories about how my grandfather, my immigrant Polish grandfather, stored barrels of whiskey in their tenement flat in North St. Louis, at least until his wife, who was also an immigrant, started sleeping on the sofa because she was afraid of being deported. And my father saw his neighbor as he was sitting on the stoop next to him, chatting with him. He saw him gunned down, killed when a car came around the corner and a guy jumped out and shot him in the head. And my mother told me tales about her helping the downstairs neighbors label bottles of bathtub gin. So all this seemed very dramatic and romantic to me for some reason, and as well as their tales about the Hooverville in St. Louis during the Depression and other things like that.
So that gives you some specific incidents and some settings. How do you then go about kind of building around those?
That's interesting for any novel, for me at least. I don't have much of an idea of where it's going. I just try to let it grow organically. I knew the settings very well for this book. Both my grandmothers lived in that neighborhood in North St. Louis of old red brick tenements, mostly pre-Civil War structures. And I spent a lot of time there playing in the alleys and on the streets. And also the other major setting in the book on Long Lake outside of St. Louis on the east side of the river in rural Granite City, I knew because I spent the first 7 years of my life there when my parents moved from North St. Louis. So there was that, and I had these characters, ideas of the characters based on people I knew from my childhood, like my father and mother, and also neighbors and friends. So it grew from that.
So then, how do you then land on who your central characters are? Like, do you take pieces of your parents or take pieces of the stories they told you? Or do you try to kind of I don't want to say obfuscate, but kind of separate?
Well, maybe romanticize would be a good phrase for it. But my father had some interesting friends from the community, from the North Side Polish community, who peopled the book, and I made characters that came from them, and also imagination. Also, everybody I've ever known or read about, these all affect you as you're writing characters, certain mannerisms or attributes or language, the way someone talks and moves, and also stories that one hears or imagines. So it all is a big stew that you start stirring around and hoping that it's going to grow and become something that people are going to want to devour.
Okay, so building on this stew metaphor, then you're putting a bunch of different ingredients into a stew.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to dishing it out,
Yeah.
how do you determine kind of what goes where on the plate?
Boy, it's a good question, and it was difficult with this book. And the book is it moves around a lot in time and place. It moves more like our conscious memories do, associations that are emotional rather than chronological. So this book, when I wrote it, I guess I wrote a lot of it chronologically, but then at times it started moving in other directions, that things would connect thematically or emotionally or geographically. Uh, so it was and I kept moving chapters around as I was writing. And the finished version, I guess I was still moving chapters around at the end and rewrote the ending of it numerous times. Uh, it's really a jumble. It's very sloppy work, like giving birth to anything. It's just because you got new people that are peopling the book, people who didn't exist until you created them, and you have stories that didn't exist until you created them. So a lot of decisions to be made.
Yeah, I was very curious about kind of the arrangement of the timelines and how much was written, linearly, or how much it was, you were bouncing around in the same way the story bounces around, and how you keep track of that.
Well, I guess the way I work usually on any novel that I've written is when I get up, and it's usually first thing in the morning, I sit down at my computer. Used to be a typewriter, now it's a computer, of course. But what has surfaced in my subconscious, my unconscious during sleep and dreams, and what was really front of mind and what I was interested in the day, that's what I would work on. So I'm never write a book chronologically. I write it scenically, where I go from scene to scene. So whatever scene or incident is front of mind or worrying me in some way, that's where I jump in. And I worry later about organizing the whole thing and get it set up.
You said worried twice there in two different kind of ways. One, the thing you're worrying about, and then what you have to worry about later as a result of that. Maybe we can unpack that. The initial worry about what you're processing or what you're trying to write scene in a scene. How conscious are you of that when you're like are you addressing themes? Are you thinking about kind of bigger picture, or are you just writing a scene for what it is and then sifting through those scenes afterwards?
Yeah, and I'm just writing the characters and writing the scenes and not really worried too much where it's going to fit. Excuse me. And maybe worrying was the wrong word to use the first time I used it. Maybe it's what was intriguing me, or what I was curious about. And as a result, the what motivates me in doing this stuff, or what compels me, is just trying to see what these characters are going to do and how that's going to develop. I know it seems sort of vague, but uh, it's um, it's a very intriguing sort of process because it's so mystical, and I don't know where things are coming from half the time.
So when you say, what a character is going to do or how it's going to develop, obviously some things reveal themselves over time in a person's life, right? Like patterns or behaviors. When you're writing and bouncing around amongst times, how then are you establishing, what things lead to other things, what actions have consequences, and which threads do you pull at?
Well, it all happens, I hope, organically, and things start linking up. It's sort of miraculous in a way that I'll be working on something, and then I'll read something in another book or something in the news, or somebody will say something to me that alerts me to some potential, a new vector for that scene or that character. So it's growing organically all the time, hopefully, and becoming more rich. And certain characters, like my one character in this uh, book, Bogdan, the godfather of AJ, the young boy who's eventually orphaned, uh, was rather a minor character at first, and then he became a major character as the book grew, and I fell in love with him in a way. he had some aspects of my father in him, who was a gambler and racetrack aficionado. But he was just this guy's a little tougher and had a certain suave joie de vivre about him, although in an ethnic way. And he became a major character in the book. Nothing that I really figured until I probably had, a couple hundred pages down already.
Yeah, I am curious about kind of like character development. And do you start with specific characters? Because you tell the story from three different perspectives ultimately, right? From AJ and his parents, that's who we really kind of get interiority of.
Right.
And I'm curious, like, do you start with the three of them, or did you start with one of them and then realize, oh, in order to tell this story, I need to kind of come at it from multiple angles?
I wish I could give rational answers to this, but it's such a convoluted process. And I usually start with a character, somebody based on somebody I knew or somebody I read about or that somehow intrigues me, or there's a story there that intrigues me. Uh, and so the characters surprise me. They grow in different ways, the ways I hadn't anticipated. So it's never cut and dried in any of this. Like it seems like I keep on repeating myself here about how slippery this whole process is. But often it's based on character against some story or incident that I was aware of.
So which character did you start with?
I guess I started with Jan, the bootlegger, who is based in part on my father, who was kicked out of his house when he was a teenager by his father, and who ended up hanging out at the library and living rough for a while. Uh, and so this was a young man, my fictional character of Jan, who figured out a way to get from underneath his father's boot and to make a success of himself by getting on the wrong side of the law and pushing liquor and also conniving to make a success out of it with some relatively ruthless schemes.
So your own father hung out at the library.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. He they spoke Polish at home back in the day, and he was born 1913, and he didn't learn to speak English until he went to public school, and as a result, he spoke a very nice dialect-free, uh, correct English that he learned from school teachers, not on the street, and also from librarians. When he was expelled from his house by his father, uh, he hung out at the library, uh, at the Central Library in St. Louis, and the librarians there saw him and started feeding him books to read. So he became a book guy and very well read and deeply read, if it broadly read, let's say, rather than deeply read. So, the character of Jan is based on him in many ways, and some of his better aspects. So my father wasn't the sort of gangland figure that Jan turns out to be.
Yeah, I was very curious because I mean, when an author puts other authors or other books in their book, I'm always that puts my antenna up. And you have both parents are avid readers, one kind of deep and one kind of wide. And I was curious about kind of like what that's saying about those characters and whether that's supposed to kind of like telegraph how they are, and it sounds like it's in pulling from your own father's kind of approach. Like, was he into history and philosophy and books like that, or is that you kind of wrestling with a character but kind of with a nod to your father?
Well, I think my father was directed that way by the librarians, just feeding him books to read history and philosophy and good poetry. I remember we had copies of Leaves of Grass and other and all the Shakespeare stuff on the bookshelf. And this was of a man who was a steel worker, worked in a factory, and he had this literature on his shelves. And then later in life, when he was not at the steel mill anymore any longer and had a white collar job, He started reading mysteries, just devouring mysteries, which I love too, and have written one set in St. Louis as well. But so and maybe that's part of the maturing or aging process. You read serious stuff when you're younger, and you get older, you start reading escape stuff.
Could be. Well, speaking of escape stuff, so AJ, the orphan, goes back to his parents' home and takes a bunch of books from there, and is specifically looking at orphan stories to kind of figure out how to chart his own path. And I'm curious about kind of someone who is writing a story, particularly drawn on references to his own parents' history, and using story to like point a way forward for the central character or like the child in that sense. Like, were you conscious of kind of like finding your way through letters?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I did a lot of research for this book, and uh, both using newspaper archives and archives from other historical institutions and whatnot, and uh, other books and sources. And as I was researching orphans, I was surprised to learn or to read, I guess I may have had passing reference to this, how important orphans have been in the history of the world, and how much they've been leaders and significant people from Moses to Huckleberry Finn, both guys who went down the river and found themselves, to Eleanor Roosevelt and Aristotle, uh, Antony and Cleopatra, all orphans. And AJ has a similar discovery as he starts reading Tom Jones and Jane Eyre and Superman and so forth, uh, all orphans. So that just sort of congealed his character for me somewhat, and how he came about to see that orphans often succeeded because they they learned self-sufficiency and also determination because they were on their own.
So timeline wise, that you decided AJ would be the orphan in this story, and then started seeking out other portrayals of orphans, and then realized what that portended for AJ in terms of like historic literary tradition.
Exactly. Yeah. Uh, I saw it helped shape his character for this novel when I saw how orphans, historic orphans, have been able to find their way through resiliency and uh, being clever like Huck Finn, or being doing good deeds like Superman, or being courageous like Tarzan. And so he used those people as role models, and that helped me determine his character.
Right. So it sounds like some of the reading that you do is kind of like vaguely purposeful, like you're reading around the subject, but not necessarily with a definitive eye to like, I need to answer this question, but it maybe provides me some answers without realizing it.
Yeah, yeah. And things just it's funny how serendipitous this is sometimes. And there's a term that Jung uses as a synchronicity. When you need something, it's sort of you find it somewhere. Some things start dovetailing. I guess your one's radar is up when you're looking for answers for character development and story and that. But then something will come from an unsuspected place. So there's a lot of synchronicity, things hooking up sort of magically in writing the book.
Well, Jung is even mentioned in the book, right? Like that
Right.
he
Yeah.
finds a Jungian quote from his father in the front of
Right.
the book. I'm curious because you have a history as a newspaper reporter. Obviously, framing a story, you have a sense of kind of where things will go, but then you have to go, assemble quotes or put the piece together. Is there something to that in terms of how you then write novels?
Yeah, I think so. Because as a newspaper reporter, I realized very quickly that what I needed to do was first write a good lead, because that's what people are going to read first. And if I write a good lead, then everything else sort of falls into place. So it's like writing a novel. If you've got a good start for the novel that somehow intrigues people or intrigues you, then that helps to bring forth what needs to follow to bring that moment. And like all good newspaper stories, you don't write about how you got there. It's like you write about what's happened first to intrigue people. And that's the way this book starts. Because in the first chapter, we have a dramatic moment where AJ finds his mother's body underneath the ice of the lake where they live.
Yeah. So I did say that you had three previous books. I mean, that's three previous novels. You have two memoirs as well, and one of them is about Long Lake, and that's obviously a setting for this book.
Right.
How important is like knowing the place in terms of writing the place to you?
Oh, I think it's everything because one needs to put in all the scenery and upholstery and all the sensory details to put people in the place where the action is happening. And there's so many scenes here. I mean, there's a big love story here. This wonderful romance between this mother and father. But you need to put people in the room where these people are. What I try to do as I'm writing a novel or a memoir even is to have people look beyond the words. I want the words to disappear on the page and have people feel the emotion or to be in the room where the scene is taking place and that. So in order to put them there, you have to put in the bird song, you have to put in the temperature, the clouds, the furniture, etc., to put them in that place with your character so they can experience it. Which is why, for me, reading a book is always better than watching a movie, because then I can really get inside myself and be in the world of the action
So
rather than just being a spectator.
your POV is kind of a not just limited to the camera.
Right, right. Because you bring your own emotions and your own experience and your own desires into that moment, and you don't always have the leisure of doing that with the movie that's clipping by frame.
You mentioned the temperature in the acknowledgments. You also mentioned, referring to, I think it was the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Yeah.
For temperature and trying to get the weather right on dates and stuff. How important is like verite when it comes to a story? Is that the kind of thing, because you're a reporter, you want to get the facts, or is that to help kind of lend credence to like, oh, this lake could have been like the water could have been frozen by this point, or it wouldn't have at that point. Those kinds of things.
It's for both. Yeah, as reporter and also as a fiction writer, I want to get that stuff right. And it's not only for the reader's gratification, it's for my gratification, it's for my sense of what my calling is here and my duty. Everything that occurs in this book has been validated through newspaper archives and other sources. So if I say it was 35 degrees that day and rainy, I know that because I looked that up in the newspaper and knew what the weather was. I knew what the headlines were that day that was going on in World War II at the time. So I try to get all that stuff right. I know there's one instance where the Western Union boy comes up with the telegram about Jan's death in France. But the boy wants to be home watching or listening to since these were radio days, listening to the Cardinals playing on radio, and I have name the pitchers in the doubleheader and name who they're playing and where the standings are, and all that stuff is all accurate. It's not made up.
You don't cheat those details.
Research. Yeah.
Yeah, no, certainly that the even some of the mentions of like specific beers that are served, I ended up like kind of Googling, Flagstaff beer, like was this a legit beer at the time? And it sounds like everything in terms of detail that's peppered in is meant to be there.
Yeah, there's a great romantic moment in the book where Jan and Hazel is his bride-to-be, and they have their first moment together and their first dance at a lakeside bar. And he goes to the jukebox and puts a nickel or a dime in and plays Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and they dance to that. And that was just a hit song with Judy Garland that was at that time, I guess it was 1939 or whenever it was, 36, when they met. And so that was actually, all that's correct. The right music, the right time, the right beer.
Right. You, Hazel at one point writes a suicide note and burns it. And I don't want to give away too much, but that, like, having her do something and then destroy it, we get it as the audience, as the readers, but it's something that's withheld from her sister. It's withheld from her child. Did you hesitate at all on, making it something where, like, we have, this bird's eye view as the reader that none of the characters have access to?
Yeah. That's a part of a common dramatic irony, I think, is the theatrical phrase for it, is where the audience knows something that the characters do not. Like, the audience may know there's a killer inside the closet door, and every time someone walks up and puts their hand on the door handle, it's a big moment for the audience, even if it's not for the characters. So it's like that I want the audience, the reader in this case, the readers, to have that sense of knowing and have that tension and the drama there, even if the characters are unaware of it.
Are you your first reader? Like, do you consider yourself, as you're writing the story, someone who's reading the story alongside yourself?
Oh, yeah. I guess I try to write books that I want to read. And I'm an eclectic reader, and my novels have all been eclectic. 2 of them set in Mexico, 2 of them in St. Louis, and 1 set in Key West. So they're 5 altogether now. And these are places I know. And the other thing I should mention, you're talking about how the characters develop, and this is something that I tell my writing students when I used to have writing students, when I was teaching more. But for me, place is always a determinant. The setting for the stories, the time and the place where it's set, because that setting determines character, as it did in Hamlet and as it did in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The setting determines character, and the character then determines the plot. So that's the way it works all the time. So you start with character, with setting, and setting leads to character, and character determines plot, and then you've got a story.
Well, there you go. That story is The Bootlegger's Bride, out through Blank Slate Press. Rick, thanks very much for joining me on the program.
Oh, it's been fun chatting.